If you think you know what solitude means, wait until you hear the incredible story of Jack Morrison and his faithful companion who changed everything with one remarkable discovery. Today, I'm going to tell you about a lonely veteran who spent 7 years hiding from the world in a remote cabin in the Oregon wilderness, convinced that his life had no purpose left. Jack Morrison had given up on humanity, but his rescue dog Ranger never gave up on him. What Ranger uncovered deep in the forest would not only save Jack's life, but reveal a secret that had been buried for decades, transforming both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. If you want to discover how this extraordinary journey of healing and hope unfolds, make sure to hit that like button right now, subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to activate those notifications, because this story will prove that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. The morning mist clung to the towering Douglas firs like ghostly fingers as Jack Morrison stepped onto the weathered porch of his cabin, coffee mug in hand, and the familiar weight of solitude pressing against his chest. 7 years he had lived in this remote corner of the Cascade Mountains, 30 miles from the nearest town of Timber Falls, Oregon. And some days he wondered if he had become more ghost than man. At 54, Jack bore the invisible scars of 2 tours in Iraq and 1 devastating tour in Afghanistan that had left him with shrapnel in his left leg and wounds in his soul that no military hospital had been equipped to heal. Ranger, his 3-year-old border collie mix, emerged from the cabin and pressed against Jack's leg with the patient loyalty that had kept the veteran anchored to life when everything else seemed meaningless. The dog had been a last-ditch effort by Jack's sister Sarah to pull her brother back from the edge of complete isolation, arriving as a gangly puppy who refused to be discouraged by Jack's initial resistance to companionship. "Another beautiful morning in paradise, eh, boy?" Jack said, his voice rusty from disuse. He spoke to Ranger more than he had spoken to humans in years, finding in the dog's intelligent brown eyes an understanding that other people couldn't provide. Ranger tilted his head and wagged his tail, responding to the bitter irony in Jack's tone, with the unconditional acceptance that had slowly, almost imperceptibly, begun to heal wounds that Jack thought would never stop bleeding. The cabin sat on 40 acres of dense forest that Jack had purchased with his military pension and disability payments, choosing isolation as his medicine and solitude as his companion. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that became impassable during the heavy winter snows. It was exactly the kind of isolation that Jack craved, a place where the nightmares of war could echo through empty valleys instead of disturbing anyone else's peace. But this morning felt different somehow, charged with an energy that Jack couldn't identify. Ranger seemed to sense it too, his ears constantly swiveling towards sounds in the forest that Jack couldn't hear, his nose working overtime as he investigated scents that carried messages beyond human comprehension. The dog's behavior had been increasingly restless over the past few days, as if something in their familiar environment had changed in ways that only his sensitive senses could detect. Jack had established a routine during his 7 years of isolation that rarely varied. Morning coffee on the porch, a check of his small vegetable garden, maintenance work on the cabin and its solar power system, an afternoon hike through the forest trails he had carved himself, and evenings spent reading by the light of an oil lamp while Ranger slept by the fireplace. It was a simple life, free from the chaos and unpredictability that had characterized his military service and the painful months of readjustment that had followed his return home. The forest had become Jack's therapy, its ancient rhythms providing a stability that human relationships had never offered. He knew every tree within miles of his cabin, every creek and deer trail, every seasonal change in the ecosystem that surrounded his refuge. The Douglas firs and western hemlocks had become his congregation, the mountain meadows his sanctuary, and the wildlife his neighbors in a community that asked nothing of him except respectful coexistence. Ranger bounded down the porch steps and began his morning patrol of the cabin's perimeter, following scent trails that told stories Jack could only imagine. The dog had adapted to their isolated life with enthusiasm, developing hunting and tracking skills that complemented Jack's survival training. Together, they were completely self-sufficient, needing nothing from the outside world except occasional supply runs to Timber Falls for items they couldn't grow, catch, or make themselves. But today, Ranger's patrol took an unusual turn. Instead of following his normal route around the cabin and garden, the dog headed straight into the forest, his body language radiating excitement and urgency. He stopped about 50 yards from the cabin and began barking, not the casual alert bark he used for deer or other wildlife, but the focused, insistent bark that meant he had found something significant. Jack finished his coffee and reluctantly followed Ranger into the forest, his boots crunching on the carpet of fallen needles and his bad leg protesting the uneven terrain. The dog had always been curious about their surroundings, but this behavior was different, more purposeful and intense than anything Jack had seen before. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked as he approached the spot where Ranger was focused. The dog was pawing at the base of an enormous old-growth cedar, his attention fixed on what appeared to be nothing more than forest floor covered with decades of accumulated organic matter. But Ranger's behavior suggested that his sensitive nose had detected something beneath the surface, something that had captured his interest so completely that he ignored Jack's initial attempts to call him away. Jack knelt beside Ranger and examined the area more closely. At first glance, it looked like any other spot in the forest, with ferns and moss growing among the fallen branches and decomposing leaves. But as Jack looked more carefully, he began to notice subtle signs that this area might be different from its surroundings. The vegetation seemed slightly disturbed, and there were faint depressions in the earth that suggested the ground had been dug up and then covered over, possibly many years ago. "You smell something down there, don't you?" Jack said, running his hand over the soft earth. Ranger responded by intensifying his pawing, whining with frustration as he tried to communicate the importance of his discovery. The dog's behavior reminded Jack of military working dogs he had known in Afghanistan, animals trained to detect buried explosives or hidden caches that could mean the difference between life and death for their handlers. Jack's military training had taught him to pay attention to details that others might overlook, and as he studied the area around the old cedar, he began to notice other anomalies. Several nearby trees showed old scarring that might have been made by tools or machinery decades ago. The forest floor in this particular spot seemed more level than the natural terrain around it, as if someone had deliberately graded and covered this area to disguise what lay beneath. The rational part of Jack's mind suggested mundane explanations. An old campsite, perhaps, or the remains of a hunting cabin that had been demolished and buried years ago. But something about Ranger's intense reaction suggested that whatever was hidden here was more significant than ordinary debris. The dog's behavior reminded Jack of the way bomb detection dogs had acted when they located hidden weapons caches in Iraq, that focused intensity that indicated a discovery of major importance. Jack spent the rest of the morning examining the area more thoroughly, using his military field experience to analyze the subtle signs that might indicate human activity. The more he looked, the more convinced he became that something substantial was buried beneath the forest floor. The depression was roughly rectangular, about 8 feet by 4 feet, and it was positioned in a location that would have been easily accessible by vehicle decades ago, before the forest had grown back to its current density. Ranger never left Jack's side during the investigation, occasionally pawing at the ground and whining softly as if urging his human companion to take action. The dog's persistence was remarkable, even for an animal known for border collie intelligence and determination. Whatever he had detected clearly warranted immediate attention, at least from his canine perspective. By afternoon, Jack had made a decision that surprised him with its spontaneity. For 7 years, he had avoided making any choices that might disrupt his carefully controlled isolation, but Ranger's discovery had awakened something in him that had been dormant since his return from the war. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the need to solve a puzzle that had been placed directly in his path. He drove his battered pickup truck to Timber Falls, making his first unscheduled trip to town in more than 2 years. The hardware store had changed owners since his last visit, but it still carried the basic tools he needed: a shovel, a pickaxe, and a metal detector that the new owner assured him would be sensitive enough to locate metal objects buried several feet underground. The trip to town was more difficult than Jack had anticipated, not because of any practical challenges, but because of the curious stares and well-meaning attempts at conversation from people who remembered him from his early days in the area. Before his self-imposed isolation, Jack had been something of a local character, the disabled veteran who had bought the old Henley place and was trying to live off the grid. Now, after years of absence, his appearance in town generated the kind of attention he had worked so hard to avoid. "Jack Morrison, as I live and breathe," called out Betty Henderson from behind the post office counter. "Haven't seen you in ages. How are you doing up there in the mountains?" Jack mumbled a polite response and hurried through his purchases, uncomfortable with the social interaction, but grateful that Ranger was waiting in the truck, providing him with an excuse to cut short any extended conversations. The dog had become his shield against unwanted human contact, a four-legged reminder that he had responsibilities that couldn't wait. The drive back to the cabin gave Jack time to wonder if he was making a mistake. His life of isolation had been peaceful, if not happy, and digging up mysterious objects in the forest could lead to complications that he was unprepared to handle. What if he found something that required him to contact authorities? What if his discovery disrupted the careful balance he had constructed between himself and the world? But Ranger's excitement was contagious, and Jack found himself actually looking forward to solving the mystery that his dog had uncovered. For the first time in years, he had a project that engaged his mind and challenged his skills, something beyond the routine maintenance tasks that filled his days, but never captured his imagination. That evening, as Jack prepared his tools and planned his excavation strategy, Ranger sat beside the old cedar as if guarding whatever secrets lay beneath its roots. The dog's dedication to the site was unwavering, and Jack began to suspect that his companion's discovery would prove to be more significant than either of them could imagine. The forest seemed unusually quiet that night, as if the ancient trees were holding their breath in anticipation of revelations that had been hidden in the earth for decades. Jack lay awake in his cabin, listening to the sounds of the wilderness and wondering what the morning would bring. For 7 years, tomorrow had always been just another day in an endless series of identical days. Now, for the first time since his self-imposed exile began, tomorrow held the promise of discovery and the possibility of change. Ranger slept fitfully beside Jack's bed, his dreams apparently filled with whatever scents and sounds had captured his attention at the base of the old cedar. The dog's restless movements and soft whines suggested that his subconscious mind was as focused on the mysterious burial site as his waking thoughts had been throughout the day. As dawn approached, Jack realized that regardless of what he might find buried in the forest, the simple act of searching had already begun to transform him. The isolation that had protected him from the pain of human contact was starting to feel less like sanctuary and more like prison, and Ranger's discovery had reminded him that there was still mystery and wonder to be found in the world, even in the remote corner of Oregon where he had chosen to hide from life. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn as Jack Morrison carried his excavation tools through the forest to the spot where Ranger waited with the patience of a sentinel. The dog had been awake before dawn, padding restlessly around the cabin until Jack finally gave up any pretense of sleep and started his day. Whatever was buried beneath the old cedar had captured Ranger's attention so completely that the normally obedient dog had refused to leave the area even for his morning meal. Jack had spent much of the night reviewing his military training in archaeological recovery, remembering techniques for excavating sensitive sites without damaging their contents. His experience in Iraq had included several instances where his unit had been called upon to investigate buried weapons caches or hidden bunkers, and those skills might prove valuable now as he attempted to uncover whatever had captured Ranger's extraordinary interest. The metal detector proved its worth within minutes of Jack's arrival at the site. As he swept the device slowly over the area where Ranger continued to paw and whine, the machine emitted a steady series of beeps that indicated the presence of substantial metal objects buried approximately 4 to 6 feet below the surface. The readings were strong and consistent, suggesting that whatever was hidden here was large, metallic, and had been in the ground for a considerable length of time. Jack began his excavation carefully, removing the organic matter and topsoil in controlled layers to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath. Ranger supervised the work with intense interest, occasionally stepping into the growing hole to investigate scents that became stronger as Jack dug deeper into the earth. The dog's behavior became increasingly excited as the excavation progressed, his tail wagging with enthusiasm and his body language radiating anticipation. 3 hours into the dig, Jack's shovel struck something solid and metallic. The sound rang through the forest like a bell, startling a family of deer that had been watching the proceedings from a respectful distance. Ranger's response was immediate and dramatic. He began barking with excitement and tried to jump into the hole to investigate the discovery firsthand. "Easy, boy," Jack said, gently restraining the excited dog. "Let's see what you've found for us." Clearing away more dirt revealed the corner of what appeared to be a large metal container, possibly a military surplus footlocker or storage chest. The metal was green with corrosion, but appeared to be structurally sound, and Jack could make out stenciled numbers and letters that had somehow survived decades of burial. As he exposed more of the container, he realized that it was much larger than he had initially thought, measuring roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and perhaps 2 feet deep. The discovery sent Jack's mind racing through possibilities. The remote location, the careful burial, and the military-style container suggested that someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide this cache many years ago. But why would anyone bury a metal chest in the middle of the Oregon wilderness, and what could it contain that was valuable enough to warrant such elaborate concealment? Ranger's behavior provided no clues about the container's contents, but his excitement suggested that whatever was inside carried scents that his sensitive nose found fascinating. The dog paced around the excavation site, whining with anticipation, and occasionally pawing at the exposed portions of the metal chest, as if trying to speed up the recovery process. It took another 2 hours for Jack to fully expose the buried container and create enough space around it to attempt opening it. The chest was secured with a heavy padlock that had corroded beyond use, but Jack's military experience had taught him several techniques for bypassing such obstacles. A few careful blows with the pickaxe shattered the rusted lock mechanism, and the lid of the chest opened with a groan that seemed to release decades of accumulated secrets. What Jack found inside took his breath away and challenged everything he thought he knew about the remote forest that had been his home for 7 years. The chest was filled with carefully wrapped packages, each one labeled with dates and locations that told an incredible story of courage, mystery, and hidden connections to one of the most turbulent periods in American history. The largest package contained dozens of photographs depicting people and events that Jack initially didn't recognize. But as he examined the images more closely, he began to realize that he was looking at documentation of activities that had taken place in this very forest during the 1960s and 1970s. There were pictures of people in military uniforms, civilians engaged in what appeared to be training exercises, and aerial photographs of the surrounding area that showed structures and facilities that no longer existed. Ranger had calmed down somewhat once the chest was opened, but he remained intensely interested in its contents, his nose working constantly as he investigated the various packages and their mysterious scents. The dog's behavior suggested that he could detect traces of people and activities that had taken place decades before his birth, stories written in chemical signatures that only his extraordinary senses could read. Among the photographs, Jack found documents that made his hands tremble with recognition and disbelief. There were military orders, training schedules, and correspondence that indicated this remote forest location had been used as a secret training facility for special operations personnel during the Vietnam War era. The facility had been so classified that its existence had been known only to a handful of high-ranking military officials and the elite soldiers who had trained there. But it was the personal items in the chest that affected Jack most profoundly. There were letters from soldiers to their families, photographs of young men who looked remarkably like Jack himself at that age, and personal effects that spoke of lives interrupted by war and duty. One letter in particular caught his attention, written by a soldier named Michael Stevens to his wife and young daughter, promising to return safely from a mission that would take him far from the Oregon mountains, where he had learned the skills that might keep him alive. The letter was dated 1971, and attached to it was a photograph of Michael Stevens standing beside the same cedar tree where Ranger had detected the buried chest. The resemblance between Michael and Jack was striking, not just in physical appearance, but in the expression of quiet determination that both men wore like armor against an uncertain world. As Jack continued to examine the contents of the chest, a larger picture began to emerge. The secret training facility had operated for nearly a decade, preparing Special Forces soldiers for covert operations in Southeast Asia and other global hotspots. The men who trained there had sworn oaths of secrecy that extended beyond their military service, binding them to carry the secrets of their forest sanctuary to their graves. But someone had decided that those secrets needed to be preserved, even if they couldn't be openly acknowledged. The chest contained what appeared to be a comprehensive archive of the facility's operations, carefully assembled and hidden by someone who understood the historical significance of what had taken place in these mountains. The burial site had been chosen with care, marked by the distinctive cedar tree, and positioned where it might someday be discovered by someone who would understand its importance. Ranger's role in the discovery suddenly seemed less coincidental and more prophetic. The dog's extraordinary senses had led Jack to a piece of military history that connected directly to his own experiences as a combat veteran. The secret training facility had prepared soldiers for the same kind of dangerous missions that Jack had undertaken in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the psychological challenges faced by those Vietnam-era warriors were remarkably similar to the struggles that had driven Jack into isolation. Among the documents, Jack found references to a program called Operation Cascade, an intensive training regimen designed to prepare Special Forces personnel for extended operations behind enemy lines. The program had been revolutionary for its time, incorporating psychological preparation techniques and survival training that wouldn't become standard military doctrine until decades later. The soldiers who completed the program were considered among the elite of their generation, capable of operating independently in hostile territory for extended periods without support or communication from their units. The more Jack read, the more he understood that he was holding in his hands the missing pieces of a story that had affected thousands of veterans and their families. Operation Cascade had been classified at such a high level that many of the men who participated in it had never been able to talk about their experiences, even with their closest family members. The psychological isolation imposed by their oaths of secrecy had contributed to the post-war adjustment problems that plagued many Vietnam veterans. But perhaps most remarkably, Jack found evidence that some of the men who had trained at the forest facility had made the same choice he had made. They had returned to the Oregon wilderness after their military service, seeking healing and peace in the same mountains where they had learned to be warriors. The chest contained correspondence and documents suggesting that several former Operation Cascade participants had purchased property in the area and established their own isolated retreats, creating an informal network of veterans who understood each other's struggles without needing to discuss the classified details of their shared experiences. Ranger seemed to sense the emotional impact that the discovery was having on his human companion, moving close to Jack's side and offering the silent comfort that had sustained the veteran through 7 years of isolation. The dog's presence provided an anchor to the present moment as Jack's mind reeled with the implications of what he had uncovered. As evening approached and the forest shadows lengthened around the excavation site, Jack carefully repackaged the contents of the chest and prepared to carry them back to his cabin. The discovery had fundamentally changed his understanding of the land where he had sought refuge, transforming it from a place of isolation into a sanctuary with deep connections to his own military experience and the broader story of American veterans who had struggled to find their place in the world after combat. The walk back to the cabin was quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps on the forest floor and Ranger's occasional soft whine as he processed the overwhelming array of scents and emotions that surrounded the day's discovery. The dog stayed close to Jack's side, as if sensing that his human companion needed extra support as he grappled with revelations that challenged everything he had believed about his chosen isolation. That night, Jack sat by his fireplace with the chest's contents spread across his table, reading by lamplight the stories of men who had walked the same paths he now walked daily, who had struggled with the same demons that had driven him into the wilderness, and who had found in these ancient forests the same peace that had slowly begun to heal his war-damaged soul. But the most profound realization came when Jack found, near the bottom of the chest, a letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this cache." The letter was written by Colonel James Harrison, the commanding officer of the secret training facility, and dated just weeks before the program's termination in 1973. In careful handwriting, Colonel Harrison had explained his decision to preserve the records of Operation Cascade and hide them in the forest that had been home to so many brave soldiers. "If you are reading this," Colonel Harrison had written, "then you have discovered the legacy of men who served their country in ways that history may never officially acknowledge. These soldiers trained in these mountains not for glory or recognition, but because their nation needed them to develop skills that might prevent larger conflicts and save American lives. They carried secrets that isolated them from their families and communities, and many of them paid a price for their service that went far beyond the physical dangers of combat." The letter continued with instructions for anyone who might discover the cache. "I have hidden these records not as military documents to be returned to official channels, but as a memorial to extraordinary men whose sacrifices deserve to be remembered, even if they cannot be publicly honored. If you have found this chest, you are likely someone who understands the burden of military service and the challenge of finding purpose after combat. I hope that learning about these men and their dedication will remind you that you are part of a brotherhood that extends across generations and conflicts, united by service and sacrifice." Colonel Harrison's final paragraph brought tears to Jack's eyes as he read it aloud to Ranger, who listened with the patient attention he gave to all of Jack's one-sided conversations. "To the veteran who finds these records, know that the isolation you may feel is temporary, but the bonds forged in service are eternal. These mountains have provided sanctuary to warriors for generations, and they will continue to offer healing to those who seek it. But remember that healing is not the same as hiding, and that the skills and strength that made you a good soldier can also make you a force for good in the civilian world. Do not let the silence of classified service make you silent about the value of your life and your potential to help others who struggle with the invisible wounds of war. As Jack finished reading Colonel Harrison's letter, he realized that Ranger's discovery had given him something far more valuable than historical artifacts or military secrets. The dog had led him to a message from the past that spoke directly to his present struggles, a reminder from men who had walked this same path before him that isolation was not the final answer to the pain of war, but simply a necessary step in the journey toward healing and renewed purpose. The forest outside his cabin seemed different now, populated not just by wildlife and ancient trees, but by the spirits of warriors who had found peace in these mountains and left behind a legacy of hope for those who would follow. Ranger settled by the fireplace with a contented sigh, his work as a messenger between past and present complete, but his role as Jack's companion and guide into an uncertain but promising future just beginning. But wait, because this incredible story is far from over. What Jack did with Colonel Harrison's message and the secrets buried in the Oregon forest would not only transform his own life, but create a legacy that would help countless other veterans find the healing and purpose they desperately needed. If you think you know how this journey of discovery and redemption ends, you're about to be amazed by what happened when Jack finally decided to break his 7 years of silence and share the extraordinary gift that Ranger had uncovered in the wilderness. The autumn morning arrived with a clarity that seemed to match the transformation occurring in Jack Morrison's mind and heart. 3 weeks had passed since Ranger's remarkable discovery, and Jack had spent those days reading and rereading every document in Colonel Harrison's cache, absorbing stories of courage and sacrifice that resonated with his own military experiences. The Colonel's letter had become his daily reading, a source of strength and guidance that slowly began to convince him that his self-imposed exile might be ending. Ranger sensed the change in his human companion, responding to Jack's increased energy and purpose with renewed enthusiasm for their daily activities. The dog had always been intuitive about Jack's moods, but now he seemed to understand that the discovery he had made would soon lead to changes in their isolated routine. Instead of resistance or anxiety, Ranger displayed anticipation, as if he had been waiting 7 years for Jack to reach the decision that was now forming in the veteran's mind. Jack's first step toward breaking his isolation was surprisingly simple. He drove to Timber Falls and purchased a cellular phone with internet access, technology he had deliberately avoided during his years of self-imposed exile. The device felt foreign in his weathered hands, but he understood that reconnecting with the outside world would require modern tools of communication that could bridge the gap between his mountain sanctuary and the broader veteran community that Colonel Harrison's letter had reminded him existed. His initial internet searches revealed a landscape of veteran support organizations and online communities that hadn't existed during his early years of isolation. Websites dedicated to helping combat veterans transition to civilian life, forums where former soldiers shared their struggles with PTSD and survivor guilt, and organizations specifically designed to assist veterans who had become isolated from their families and communities. The resources were overwhelming in their scope and compassion, offering hope to men and women who thought they were fighting their battles alone. But it was a website called Silent Warriors that captured Jack's attention and convinced him that Colonel Harrison's message about brotherhood and shared sacrifice was more than nostalgic rhetoric. The site was dedicated to veterans of classified military operations, providing a secure forum where former Special Forces personnel could connect with others who understood the unique challenges of carrying secrets that couldn't be shared with family members or civilian friends. Jack spent hours reading posts from veterans who described isolation and adjustment problems remarkably similar to his own experiences. Men and women who had served in conflicts spanning from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan, united by the common experience of carrying classified knowledge that made normal social relationships difficult or impossible. Many described the same journey Jack had taken: initial attempts at civilian integration, followed by increasing isolation as the gap between their experiences and civilian understanding became unbridgeable, and finally retreat to remote locations where they could find peace without having to explain or justify their need for solitude. But the website also featured success stories. Veterans who had found ways to emerge from isolation without abandoning the hard-won peace they had discovered in solitude. These stories shared common themes: the importance of connecting with other veterans who understood classified service, the value of finding purpose through helping others who struggled with similar challenges, and the possibility of using their unique skills and experiences to make positive contributions to society. One story particularly resonated with Jack's situation. A former Special Forces operator named Robert Chen had spent 8 years living alone in the Montana wilderness before discovering a cache of documents from a forgotten World War II training facility on his property. The discovery had led him to research the history of veteran isolation and eventually to establish a retreat center where combat veterans could find temporary refuge while working through their readjustment challenges. Robert's retreat center operated on the principle that healing required both solitude and community, providing veterans with the space they needed to process their experiences while gradually reconnecting them with supportive networks of people who understood their struggles. The facility had helped hundreds of veterans transition from destructive isolation to productive integration with civilian society, proving that the skills that made excellent soldiers could also make effective counselors, educators, and advocates for veteran rights. Jack's hands trembled as he composed his first message to the Silent Warriors Forum, introducing himself with the code name Cascade Ranger and briefly describing his situation without revealing classified details of his service or recent discovery. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with dozens of veterans welcoming him to the community and offering support, understanding, and practical advice for breaking free from destructive isolation. But the message that most profoundly affected Jack came from Robert Chen himself, who had somehow recognized the significance of Jack's chosen code name. In a private communication, Robert explained that he had been researching Operation Cascade for years as part of his work with isolated veterans, having encountered several former participants who had struggled with the psychological aftermath of their classified training. He invited Jack to visit the Montana Retreat Center and to consider sharing his story with other veterans who might benefit from understanding that they were not alone in their struggles. The invitation terrified and excited Jack in equal measure. After 7 years of avoiding human contact beyond necessary interactions with store clerks and service providers, the thought of deliberately seeking out a community of strangers was almost overwhelming. But Colonel Harrison's letter had planted a seed of purpose that was beginning to grow, and Jack found himself considering the possibility that his isolation had been preparation for something greater rather than a permanent retreat from life. Ranger seemed to sense Jack's internal debate, staying close to his side during the long hours spent reading messages from other veterans and researching organizations dedicated to helping former military personnel find purpose and community. The dog's calm presence provided stability as Jack contemplated changes that would fundamentally alter the carefully controlled life they had built together in the Oregon wilderness. The decision finally came during one of their routine hikes through the forest as they passed the site where Ranger had made his extraordinary discovery. Jack stood beside the ancient cedar tree and reflected on the journey that had brought him from isolation to the edge of renewed engagement with the world. Colonel Harrison's cachet had reminded him that he was part of a continuum of warriors who had found healing in these mountains, and that his responsibility extended beyond his own recovery to helping others who faced similar struggles. "What do you think, boy?" Jack asked Ranger, who was investigating the now refilled excavation site with casual interest. "Think it's time for us to come down from the mountain?" Ranger's response was an enthusiastic bark and a vigorous wagging of his tail, as if he had been waiting years for Jack to ask that question. The dog bounded toward the trail that led back to their cabin, pausing to look back with an expression that clearly communicated his readiness for whatever adventure lay ahead. That evening, Jack composed a long email to Robert Chen, accepting the invitation to visit the Montana Retreat Center and offering to share his discovery of the Operation Cascade cache with other veterans who might benefit from understanding their connections to the broader history of military service. He also outlined a proposal that had been forming in his mind, the establishment of a similar retreat facility on his Oregon property, providing isolated veterans with access to the same healing environment that had gradually restored his own emotional equilibrium. The response came within hours, filled with enthusiasm and practical suggestions for implementing Jack's vision. Robert explained that the need for veteran retreat centers far exceeded the current availability of such facilities, and that Jack's property in the Oregon wilderness would be ideal for serving veterans from the Pacific Northwest region. He offered to provide training, resources, and ongoing support for establishing and operating a retreat center based on the successful model he had developed in Montana. But perhaps most significantly, Robert revealed that several former Operation Cascade participants had found their way to his facility over the years, and that they had formed an informal support network for veterans of classified programs who struggled with isolation and inability to discuss their experiences with civilian counselors. Jack's willingness to come forward would complete a community that had been waiting decades for someone who could speak with authority about the specific challenges faced by Operation Cascade veterans. As Jack prepared for his first journey away from his mountain sanctuary in 7 years, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him to this moment. Ranger's remarkable discovery had not only uncovered an important piece of military history, but had provided Jack with the key to understanding his own struggles and the path forward from destructive isolation to purposeful engagement with the world. The dog seemed to understand the significance of their upcoming departure, spending extra time investigating every corner of their forest home, as if memorizing scents and landmarks that might be important for future reference. But rather than sadness or anxiety about leaving their sanctuary, Ranger displayed excitement and anticipation, his behavior suggesting that he understood their mountain retreat had served its purpose and that new adventures awaited them. Jack's sister, Sarah, called that evening, responding to his first communication with family in more than 3 years. Her voice was filled with tears of relief and joy as she listened to Jack describe his discovery and his plans for helping other veterans find healing and purpose. She had never stopped believing that her brother would eventually find his way back from the darkness that had consumed him after his return from Afghanistan, but she had feared that his isolation might become permanent. "I always knew Ranger was special," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. "When I brought him to you as a puppy, something told me he would be exactly what you needed. I just never imagined he would lead you to something this amazing." The conversation with Sarah reminded Jack of all the relationships that his isolation had damaged or severed completely. Connections with family and friends who had tried to help him but had eventually given up in the face of his determined withdrawal from society. His recovery would require more than just helping other veterans. It would also require rebuilding the personal relationships that gave life meaning beyond service and sacrifice. But those challenges lay ahead, along with the work of establishing a retreat center and connecting with a community of veterans who shared his experiences and struggles. For now, It was enough to know that Ranger's extraordinary discovery had transformed his life from empty isolation into purposeful anticipation of the contributions he could make to the healing of others. As Jack packed for their journey to Montana, he carefully included Colonel Harrison's cache, understanding that the documents and artifacts were not just historical curiosities, but tools for helping other veterans understand their place in the continuum of military service and sacrifice. The Colonel's letter would be particularly valuable for veterans who struggled with the silence imposed by classified service, providing them with permission to find pride and purpose in contributions that might never be publicly acknowledged. Ranger supervised the packing process with intelligent interest, occasionally adding items to Jack's pile by bringing him objects from around the cabin that the dog apparently considered essential for their journey. Among Ranger's contributions was a wooden walking stick that Jack had carved during his early years of isolation, a tangible reminder of the skills and patience he had developed during his time in the wilderness. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the meadows around Jack's cabin and the first snow of the season dusting the high peaks that surrounded his mountain sanctuary. As they loaded Jack's truck and prepared to leave, both man and dog took a last look around the property that had been their refuge and teacher for 7 transformative years. "We'll be back," Jack promised Ranger, who was sitting patiently in the passenger seat with the dignity of a seasoned traveler. "But next time, we won't be coming back alone." The drive down the mountain road that Jack had traveled so rarely during his years of isolation felt like a journey through time as well as space, each mile carrying them further from the protective solitude of the forest and closer to the complex challenges and opportunities of the human community they were rejoining. But for the first time in years, Jack felt ready for those challenges, armed with the wisdom gained from solitude and the sense of purpose provided by Ranger's remarkable discovery. The story of their isolation was ending, but the story of their service to others who struggled with the invisible wounds of war was just beginning. Colonel Harrison's cache had reminded Jack that every veteran's struggle was connected to the struggles of those who had served before and those who would serve in the future, and that the healing found in solitude was meant to be shared with others who needed the same hope and understanding. And if this incredible journey of discovery and transformation has moved you as much as it has moved me, then you understand why stories like Jack and Ranger's are so important to share with the world. This tale of isolation, discovery, and renewed purpose reminds us that healing is possible for everyone, that sometimes our darkest moments can lead to our greatest contributions, and that the bonds forged in service extend far beyond individual struggles to create communities of support and understanding. The courage that Jack found to leave his mountain sanctuary and help other veterans proves that no one has to face their battles alone, and that sometimes the most remarkable discoveries are waiting in our own backyard. If this story inspired you, please hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of hope and healing. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss these powerful reminders that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they find the courage to serve others. Share this story with anyone who needs to hear that isolation doesn't have to be permanent, that purpose can emerge from the darkest places, and that sometimes salvation comes through the most unexpected messengers, like a loyal dog who refuses to give up on the human he loves.